depending upon which Jewish community that you were a part of, would have mattered on whether or not you read the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew or in Greek or in maybe some other language. But nonetheless, the geography made much of the difference. Not only for the language that it was read in or written in, but also it determined sometimes the particular books that may have been read in it, especially with regard to the writings. We know, like, for instance, at Qumran, there were books that are not in anybody's canon, that are not anywhere, that some of them used. We don't know the exact nature of the way that they used them. Nonetheless, they were there. The Septuagint included books that are considered deuterocanonical in the Roman Catholic Church, the Apocrypha from the Protestant point of view. And in various places, those were read or not read, depending upon, again, exactly where you were. But the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD created a completely different atmosphere. There was a obvious power vacuum, and central headquarters was lacking in Jerusalem. The temple was gone, the Sanhedrin was gone, the basic Jewish leadership that existed for so much time was no longer in existence. And the Jewish diaspora spread across the world. And many of them were reading from the Septuagint. At the same time, you have these new communities that are Christian communities that, in the case of Paul, for instance, he had been taking from the synagogue, which caused much problem, as we see in the book of Acts. And so some postulate that what I'm about to say was a direct response to what happened in the Christian community. And we don't know this for sure, but nonetheless, there was a council that we call the Council of Jamnia or Jabneh, and the nature of this particular council is debated. And in fact, whether or not even to call it a council or a synod or any kind of group that had actual authority. There was a rabbi who had asked for permission from the Roman government to start a school in Jabneh. And as the story goes, he traveled there, he created this particular school, and there, in an academic setting, these people began to debate things and talk about Scripture, which is kind of a Jewish tradition, right? To debate and to talk about Scripture. We have the Mishnah, for example, is the written history of these disagreements and among various different scholars. But nonetheless, some contend that there was a Council of Jamnia in the year 90 AD, either as a response to or for whatever reason to create the canon of the Hebrew Scriptures. However, there is simply no evidence that this is the case. If we look at what they did talk about several books, Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, for instance, and Chronicles. Chronicles had been debated for some time. But really the focus there was on Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, about whether or not, as to quote here, whether or not they make the hands unclean. And the idea of making the hands unclean would be that whenever I read that text, it makes my hands unclean because it's so holy. Or it doesn't make my hands unclean because it's not really a holy book. That was their idiom for determining whether or not it was a holy book or not a holy book. And they concluded that these two books, in fact, did make their hands unclean. All right. The other issue that was discussed was fasting and feast days, whether who had authority or when they should practice feasts or fasts. And, that was really the outcome of this particular meeting. Now, even if, let's just say as a hypothetical, that the meeting in Jamnia really was a discussion of which books were canonical, and they named them out very specifically, which books were canon and which ones were not. It's unlikely that it would have had the kind of authority that people want to place on this council. And the reason is bound up within Jewish tradition itself. The Jewish people had no problem at all with differing opinions. In fact, there wasn't sometimes one right answer. There may have been 3 or 5, and we see this within the Mishnah. There are disagreements about particular passages of Scripture and how they should be applied. And it would say Rabbi Gamaliel said this, and another rabbi said this, and so on. And there will be 3 opinions, or 4 opinions, or 5 opinions. And depending upon your persuasion, you may go with one school or another. And so even if this council did have authority, it would have been authority at most on par with those schools that had been in place before, which seemed to have authority just like other schools. In other words, you could have an opinion from this particular school, and there'd be an opinion from this school, and it's up to you to choose which one that you may want to go along with, the one that you may want to follow. If you went over to the school of Gamaliel and you followed all of his teachings and all the ways that he thought it should be applied. And so this council really didn't do what it is that people want to make the claim that it did, at least not in the way that we understand it. In fact, the entire biblical canonization process didn't go the way that many people want it to, or many people claim. And that's from varying different sources, whether it's from an atheist point of view or from a Christian or Jewish point of view. There was no real authoritative council that made decisions that just simply applied everywhere in Christianity or everywhere in Judaism. It simply wasn't the case, and that's not how canonization worked, right? Nonetheless, we have no other real council or anything with any kind of authority that deals with the biblical books all the way until the time of the Reformation. And I'll talk about that briefly in just a moment, but really I need to get at something else first. And that's the Hebrew scriptures themselves. Beginning in the 6th century through the 8th century, there's a group called the Masoretes, and they take the Hebrew text and they begin to take responsibility for copying and passing on the text. And what we understand is that people forgot or didn't understand how to pronounce particular words. And the reason why that might have been an issue is because Hebrew is a language of consonants. There are no vowels. There were no vowel system. There's no vowel pointings, nothing. It didn't exist. But the Masoretes created this vowel pointing system in order to help people with pronunciation. And they printed this in the text on the words. And they also added notes in the margins about which words were vocalized, which were not, and traditional understandings of particular words and their usages in the text. So they took great care to do this. And over the next couple hundred years, they developed essentially the Hebrew canon because Jewish people everywhere began to use that particular canon, the one that was curated by the Masoretes. And in that way, of this process of a couple hundred years, there was a Jewish canon that was formed by the Masoretes because people accepted what they did, and it was used worldwide in the synagogue. And this is the way in which the Hebrew canon came to be. That happens also to be the same canon of Scripture that's used within many Protestant traditions. Now, we need to talk about something else that happens after this, however. The Fifth Council of the Lateran took place in the year 1517, I believe in March. And there were some decisions that were made there which caused much disruption among the Christian communities. And in particular, Martin Luther. He was already at a point where he was sort of fed up with the way that things were. And in October of the same year, October 31st, 1517, he nailed what's known as the 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Church. Now, this wasn't a new thing to do this. This was a common practice among academics and scholars to do this. So these were things to be talked about. But it came at a time whenever there was already a questioning of authority in the air. And so this caused great issue for the Vatican, for the Pope, for the religious leaders. Eventually, a papal bull was issued that condemned most of Martin Luther's theses as being heresy or anathema. But Martin Luther didn't stop, right? He continued to question, to try to understand. And really, the thing that was in the air was the idea of questioning authority in general. Why do we believe the things we believe? Why do we listen to the people that we listen to? Who said this person has authority? Why would we listen to this particular council? Why does the Council of the Lateran matter? Why does the Council of Ephesus matter, or Constantinople, or some document that comes from the Vatican, or a statement from a king? And this general questioning of authority, there was a questioning of whether or not people needed to listen to Rome at all, right? And we know that in England, this happened with Henry VIII and the breaking off of Rome and him becoming the head of the church in that particular place. And so these things were happening all over in Europe, this general questioning of authority. And Luther went so far as to say, what, I'm not sure even that the books that I have, I shouldn't question. And he began to do that. And in most places, not only Luther, but in other places, they questioned the deuterocanonical books or the Apocrypha, depending upon your persuasion, and began to say, I don't think that these have theological authority. They don't have canonical authority. They don't have authority in the church. Luther even went further than that, and he called the book of James a book of straw. And he had great difficulty in understanding the difference between James and Paul, and that caused him some consternation. He eventually reconciled this, but nonetheless, there was a general questioning of all of these things. And as time went on, there was sort of a shakeup within biblical literature, like which books are actually in the canon and which are not. And this is actually the time when people began to make these real decisions, the ones that didn't really happen in the early church, not in this way, because the 39 articles were produced by the Church of England, in which they delineated which particular books were part of the canon and which were not. And that didn't happen until 1563. And then in 1647, there was the Westminster Confession of Faith, which delineated again the same books that the 39 Articles delineated, saying that, what, these are the books that we use, these are canon. And the other books, the Apocrypha, they're useful, they're inspirational, we use them in the church, they should be used, but nonetheless, they're not canon. And in response to all of the mess that was going on, the Roman Catholic Church believed that it was time to have another ecumenical council. They'd been trying to have one since the Fifth Council of the Lateran, but it didn't happen because there wasn't only disagreements verbally, there was violence. In fact, Rome itself was sacked by mercenary soldiers of Charles V because he wasn't able to pay them. And so they sacked Rome, and they used the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica as a stable for their horses, and captured the Pope and demanded a ransom of land and money and all sorts of things. There were tons of problems happening. And there was this constant bleed from within the Roman Church of people turning to various different Protestant faiths. And so the church convened what's known as the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent was essentially a counter-Reformation council. They came together to decide, in fact, what is the doctrine that we're going to double down on? What are the canon of Scripture? And so they delineated these things. They named the specific books. And in fact, the Council of Trent said that the deuterocanonical books were on the same level and authority as the rest of the books of Scripture and also of the tradition of the church. And so that was in response to people who were removing them, like Luther. So it's not until there's a real issue when people begin to dig in and decide what books are in and what books are out. So this is the time period in which these things were decided, the 1500s and the 1600s. Prior to that, the canon of Scripture was simply the canon of Scripture. Suddenly, though, there was this great upset, right, that we call the Reformation, and the scientific revolution that followed, the Enlightenment, all these other competing ideas that came in, and people were questioning everything and finally coming to rest on what they believed were the books that needed to be in Scripture and the books that were to be excluded from Scripture. And therein we get the final determination of what is the canon of Scripture, not only from a New Testament perspective, but also from the Hebrew Scriptures and an Old Testament perspective. And that is the finalization of the biblical canonization process. That's not to say that there weren't these books weren't canon before, because they were, but there's finally some sort of real meeting where people have actually decided these books are in and these books are out. It doesn't happen for 1,500 years. That's the reality of the situation, and that's how these books became canon. The church looked back, decided these books have always been, and they should always be. I want to give some context for my reasoning here to put things into perspective. Bouncing all the way to the Council of Trent, I'm going to get some pushback from some, but I want to again put my reasoning out there. So some will cite, say, the Council of Rome in 382 as being a definitive date when the council made a decision about the canon of Scripture. But there's a couple of problems with that claim. It's only seen as, historically reliable by a certain group of people. But the Council of Rome, whether or not it took place, is going to be irrelevant at the end of the day, as I'll explain. But nevertheless, the council is said to be in 382 under the Pope Damascus, who calls it. However, it's not pushed out until later by a different pope, by Gelasius, who doesn't come to be in charge until over 100 years after Damascus. Now, there's said to be these the decrees of Damascus that's sent out by Gelasius, again, which is 100 and some odd years after this council is said to have taken place. Now, the interesting element of this is that these decrees carry with it quotes from Augustine, who had not written these particular writings yet prior to the Council of Damascus, or when it was said to have taken place. It had to be written after that and prior to Gelasius. So therefore, Gelasius is at least, or his people, at best, taking quotes from Augustine and adding them to something that either pre-existed in some form and they're adulterating the text, or it didn't exist at all and he invented it. Next, the other problem with the Council of Rome is that it really doesn't appear in documentation until the 8th or 9th centuries. So we're talking about a bounce forward from the 5th century to the 8th or 9th century before it's actually quoted, listed anywhere, or seemed to have any kind of distribution. Which leads many to think that it was a forgery that was created later, some pseudepigrapha, something created later to justify some decision or some issue with the Roman Pope, or the Roman bishop rather. But nevertheless, there's multiple problems here in the historicity of whether the Council of Rome actually happened. Secondly, it's a trouble because it's really more of a regional issue, not really. It doesn't really have authority, and I'll explain that further by referencing the Council of Hippo and the Council of Carthage, or rather the many councils of Carthage, because there are quite a few of them. So now the Council of Hippo and the Council of Carthage, both of them take place inside of the 4th century. However, they are regional, and there was people from the immediate area that are attending these things, and they didn't have the force that some people believe they had when they're looking back. It's anachronistic to look back and say, well, these people got it right, therefore they have force, right? And the only reason that Carthage or Hippo have any sort of force at all are because of the councils that come later that affirm what's already in those councils. If those councils would have found differently, if there would have been a different list of books in them, then they would have simply been ruled as heretical and not referenced at all or dropped out of history, because we have people such as, say, John of Damascus, who's writing in the 7th in the 700s, and his canon is different than the canon of other people. In fact, his canon includes First and Second Clement in the New Testament writings. And so, how much can we say about these councils and their authority when there are people within the church all over the place who have varying different uh, biblical canons? They don't match. And later we have the Council of Florence, which actually is a bigger worldwide thing that happens. And the reason I still don't think it has the force of the Council of Trent is because of the language of the Council of Florence with regard to the scriptures. It says that they were inspired, but it doesn't use the word canon. It's not very dogmatic about this. It's not until the Council of Florence, the Council of Trent, about 100 years later, where it's very dogmatic and very matter of fact that these are the canons. This is the canon of Scripture. These are the books that are included within the canon. They make that declaration, very pointedly, as I know, because of disturbances. In fact, all of the councils in general, their responses to things that are happening out in culture and in the world. They're not coming together and saying, these are our decisions, and then they go out and live in the world. They're looking at things after the fact, right? They're looking at issues that have come up either theologically or culturally, and then responding to them and making affirmations or denials based on the faith, and looking at the culture around them and determining whether or not these things are valid or not. And that's what happens all the way in the Council of Trent. It's a very dogmatic explanation of what the scriptures are and the rule of faith for the church. It's very clear. And we really don't have any struggles with canon after that, either from the Roman Catholic side, after the Council of Trent, and on the Protestant end, from the 39 Articles and the Westminster Confession, things pretty much stay the same. It's pretty much done at that point, some 500 and some odd years ago. But leading up to that point, I don't think that the church really felt that it needed to respond in that way. There were these regional things that happened, like the Council of Carthage and the Council of Hippo, but they're dealing with local issues that are happening within their area, and they don't have the theological punch or the authority that some of these other councils later and confessions do have. And by the way, personal opinion here, not historical, but I am saying that the canon itself is the canon, and it's that way, sort of like a Venn diagram. If I take these various different geographies and I overlap what these people were using in the churches over one another, I end up with some core in the middle that's common to all of these different geographical areas. And that commonality in the middle of that Venn diagram happens to be the canon of Scripture that we use. And the various different pieces that people were using all over the place end up dropping off, not because the church said, stop that, but because they just dropped off. They found them not as useful. They weren't as moving for the congregation. They didn't impart the same kind of impact to people when they read them. They were of a different quality and character whenever they were read, etc. They just drop away. And so the center of that Venn diagram is the canon of Scripture, which has essentially been there from the beginning. And most of the councils and everything else that happened are largely irrelevant. What they're doing is recognizing what had already been. They're not making a declaration and causing something to be. Their purpose is to affirm something that has been before. So that's going to conclude our study on the canonization process. There's lots of details that I didn't go into in this process. This is sort of an overview, a very rough overview, but I just wanted to give people an idea of what that process looked like. So join me in the next series. See you guys next time.